Welcome to Block and Build, a podcast from Convergence Magazine. I'm your host and the publisher of Convergence, Caden Mott. On this show, we're building a roadmap for the movement that's working to block the impacts of rising authoritarianism while building the strength and resilience of the broad front that we need to win. This week on the show, we'll take a look at the relationship between AI and labor rights, breaking down a new report from Data and Society entitled Last Place in the AI-First Economy, How the AI Industry Relies on Worker Disempowerment. I'm joined today by two of its authors, Alexandra Mateescu and Aiha Nguyen, to talk about the adoption of AI technology and how it's hollowing out the rights of workers and exacerbating existing inequalities. We'll also explore how we can help build a future that prioritizes workers' rights over big tech's bottom lines. But first, these headlines. I guess we have a peace deal with Iran? The full details aren't available at the time of this recording, but Trump has been bragging about how the Strait of Hormuz will be open this week. Honestly, the main achievement in this agreement that we know about so far, that the strait will be back open for maritime trade, was a problem that Trump's blundering so-called strategy created in the first place. In a lot of ways, Iran could get quite a bit out of the deal, including relief from U.S. sanctions if certain conditions are met. But notably, Israel, which has participated in war-making, is not a party to the agreement. Meanwhile, some of Trump's own allies in Washington expressed skepticism about the deal. Senator Lindsey Graham, not exactly a dove, pointed out that it seems that Iran's perspective on the agreement is a bit divergent from what the new U.S. negotiating team thinks about it. So we'll see what happens next because the boondoggle continues. Last Thursday, a board member of the Ohio Organizing Collaborative, a statewide organization focused on base building and get-out-the-vote efforts, reported that FBI agents raided their Northeast Ohio offices. Prentice Haney told the press that about 100 agents showed up and were demanding and accusing people of voter fraud as if it was a witch hunt. Reports also suggest that agents went out and questioned both current and past organizers affiliated with the group. While the FBI has not publicly stated a reason for this raid, the weaponization of the FBI and other agencies under Trump 2.0 is certainly nothing new. But this is the first instance that we're aware of that a formal organizing group has been the target in this way. We've seen these intimidation games from the White House play out already, like the raid a few months ago on a Georgia County Board of Elections, part of Trump's ongoing contestation of his 2020 election loss in that state. And we know that the White House is preoccupied with the supposed security threats posed by social movement left organizations across the country. But why this organization, in a state that Donald Trump won by 11 points and is gerrymandered into a heavy Republican deadlock? OOC faces a challenging uphill battle, even without this kind of interference. I think a lot of this is frankly about creating a drumbeat in advance of the midterms that makes it easier for MAGA to cast doubt on the results if, say, Sherrod Brown manages to claw back a Senate seat in the fall. They want to show evidence that they're doing the good hard work of keeping these organizations in line. In the meantime, now's a great time to make sure that your organization has its house in order, from compliance and record keeping to making sure staff understand how to respond to this type of legal intimidation. In advance of the kickoff of the 2026 World Cup last week, Somali FIFA referee Omar Abdulkader Artan, who's been a ref for FIFA since 2018, was denied entry to the United States. While games were being played across the US, Mexico, and Canada, all of the refs were required to attend a pre-tournament briefing in Miami. Before coming to the US, Artan acquired multiple visas and even received a special diplomatic passport, but apparently that wasn't enough. He reported after returning to Somalia that he was stopped and questioned for 11 hours about his relationship with Islamist groups Al-Qaeda and Al-Shabaab before being put on a flight back to Istanbul, his point of origin. Honestly, this shit is just embarrassing. It's embarrassing that FIFA has bent over backwards to accommodate Donald Trump at the expense of their own officiating staff. It's embarrassing that Customs and Border Protection is so deep in Trump's racism that a guy who's been a referee for international soccer for 8 years is being subjected to this kind of scrutiny. I heard someone describe what's happening with this World Cup as kind of the inverse of sports washing. Instead of using this major sporting event to present a kinder, gentler face of fascism, MAGA is just doubling down on the racism and the cruelty, and is suffering few, if any, consequences for it. This episode is brought to you by the Ballot Initiative Strategy Center, a Convergence Headwaters member. If you're interested in ballot measures, people-powered change, and the future of our democracy, BISC has a great new podcast called Direct Democracy Diaries. The show digs into the issues, stories, and strategies shaping democracy right now. The podcast was also named a Webby Award honoree in its first season, so after this episode, go check out Direct Democracy Diaries, wherever you get your podcasts. While we hear plenty of predictions about how the adoption of AI will kill millions of jobs in the future, it's already gutting labor rights and alienating workers right now. Alexandra Mateescu and Aiha Nguyen are two of the researchers behind a new report on this matter, Last Place in the AI First Economy: How the AI Industry Relies on Worker Disempowerment. The report shows that workers are facing an increasingly hostile environment as AI not only risks taking away jobs directly, but also corresponds with an erosion in workers' rights and protections. Alexandra serves as a researcher at the Labor Futures Initiative at Data and Society Research Institute, publishing work that focuses on issues like digital worker surveillance, algorithmic inequality, and harmful practices from the tech industry. Aiha Nguyen is director of the Labor Futures Initiative, leading research on the relationship between technology and labor. In today's episode, we talk to Alexandra and Aiha about their report and how we can bolster labor rights in the face of AI threats. Take a listen. I am joined now by researcher at the Labor Futures Initiative at Data and Society, Alexandra Mateescu. Alexandra, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here.
And we're also joined by the director of the Labor Futures Initiative at Data and Society, Aiha Nguyen. Aiha, thank you for being here.
Thank you for the invitation.
So we're talking about this report that you put together that was published in April called Last Place in the AI First Economy. Can you first tell our listeners a little bit about what that means and where this research came from, why you think it was an important intervention to make in the conversation about this quote-unquote AI first economy? Alexandra, I'll toss it to you first.
Sure, yeah. So I think this report is kind of the latest in a series of sort of short primers that we've been publishing for years now, trying to kind of create short, accessible reads on specific topics that impact workers in the realm of AI and technology. So we've done ones on worker surveillance, on algorithmic management, on the ways that workers are challenging worker datafication in their workplace. We had a previous one on generative AI that was just more broadly looking at the impacts of AI on workers. And the latest one that we did was this report was essentially trying to find a way to connect a lot of disparate threads happening across the labor movement that tend to kind of be isolated within very sector-specific conversations. So what we did for part of this report was talking to folks in various labor unions across industries like healthcare, journalism, entertainment, creative labor, higher education, warehousing, kind of all over the place, to kind of ask the question of like, how do we situate AI within already familiar labor struggles? How seriously should we take the threat of AI, especially when we're living in a time of multiple crises, as well as kind of a response to frustration with a lot of the kind of AI job displacement discourse that sort of treats AI like this spreading wildfire and we just need to let it run its course. And then we'll be here to kind of pick up the pieces afterwards, rather than this is a set of financially and ideologically driven policy decisions that are often naturalizing these choices as if they're the outcome of technology. So the report is kind of the outcome of pointing to a lot of the core themes that we saw of what, people saw as the more pressing issues, what questions they felt were unanswered, as well as just a general absence of information that often gets filled with speculations about like job displacement, press releases, self-reporting from corporations of like, mass layoffs that kind of give a false impression over how AI is being used in the workplace. So essentially, the overarching goal of this report was to collect some of the language and arguments needed to approach AI with a baseline critical lens.
I think I'm also really interested in this process too, because one of the things that is very clear is that you all are actually talking to like workers and worker leaders, and it's not just this sort of like, it's not just conceptual, right? It's like, what is like very materially the experience of workers in this moment of like great transformation? Could you talk a little bit also, I guess, to the process too of putting together this report? Because it's a little different in that way from some other stuff I've read as well.
I'm happy to step in at this point and talk briefly about that. I think for us, what we recognized early on was the voices of workers and communities were very much absent from the conversation and dialogue around how AI was affecting not just labor, but society at large. And one of the reasons for that is workers are often given two choices. Either you augment or you will be automated. And there was nothing in between. But the reality is that the experiences of workers was very different. So we spoke with labor advocates, community organizations, academics, and policy people to really understand how they were actually seeing AI land on the ground, and also what were the big research questions that they had about how this was affecting workers. And so we conducted 15 interviews, long form conversations, and we found that it was sort of all over the place. Some we're not sure if they were even working with AI because that term itself is so vague. It's sometimes people referring to just a camera as AI without knowing whether there was any machine learning involved, but there was this vector that there could be. And others who had actually experienced some of the work being automated to a significant degree such that it was affecting their ability to make a living. So through that process, we were able to identify what were the main concerns, but also what were the mechanisms that were also happening at the same time that AI was being introduced in workplaces that could be contributing to the situation that we're in now.
I think another really interesting thing is that there's a tendency to treat the impacts of AI on the workforce as if it's like undifferentiated whole of AI and undifferentiated whole of workers, but actually the ways that workers are relating to AI differs vastly across occupations, across class divisions, all of that. So like most of the high profile attention that came when AI came on the scene was specifically with the SAG-AFTRA WGA strikes, which like entertainment workers, like actors, screenwriters, motion capture workers, the nature of how those AI tools were introduced were more specifically around issues around like ownership, control, compensation, things like that. But often in like other industries, like say call centers, the relationship to AI is way more close to like algorithmic management or different kinds of surveillance. It's very different from like education contexts where often it's about like, philosophies of pedagogy and how like, teachers should have a say in how teaching is. So like the challenges are very different across industries. And also there's, of course, the challenge that the overwhelming majority of US workers are not unionized. So there's not even necessarily a place where there can be a kind of like emerging set of values to kind of coalesce around a particular goal, like collective bargaining or something like that. So that's one of the challenges of just talking about AI or about labor in the abstract that we were kind of trying to like bring down a little to like actual concrete issues.
Yeah, no, that's such a good insight because I do think that like I noticed this too in the way that also organizers talk about AI is that like a lot of times there are some like underlying assumptions that really only come out when you really start digging into the subject matter and you realize, oh, you're talking about AI in the sense of like, how are people automating like pickers in warehouses or whatever? And it's like very different from something somebody else might be talking about I don't know. The like quote in the paper from Meta about their programmers being expected to work 5 times faster with AI was like, what does it even mean when you basically have a creative job? Like that, like that's a really, it's like both these things are about kind of speed ups and quote unquote efficiency, but like the way that they play out and the way that they're experienced is really, really different.
I would add to that comment about the speed up is it's also arbitrary.
Right.
This does not at all reflect what the technology can and cannot do. That there was a mandate from management that you should be 5 times faster. Is this actually what the technology accomplishes? We don't actually know.
It sounds like marketing more than anything else, actually, than like an actionable instruction from your boss. Like.
Well, there was actually a news story just the other day, I think from Financial Times, about how Amazon's corporate employees are essentially, Amazon has these internal adoption targets for employees of what percentage their work has to be to use AI. And it's basically creating these perverse incentives where employees are actually using software to automate AI activity to boost up their AI consumption to please managers. So that's partly what we were trying to get with like our section that we had about like weaponized efficiency narratives, is that like efficiency is often a cudgel to steamroll opposition to AI in workplaces and to be able to, reach objectives that end up like retroactively justifying, AI investments that, large corporate actors are betting on right now.
Yeah, that is just like so grim to be like, oh, I have to automate my use of automation to show my boss that I'm automating. Like, oh my God. Like, Well, speaking of if like this sort of like mandate of efficiency is like one of the big themes that you pulled out, let's talk about the like 4 big categories of changes to workplaces that you all tracked. What are those categories, and could you provide us like a brief explanation or an example of each one of those things? I guess we started with the sort of like forced efficiency, but is there anything else that you'd like to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, some of the things that we point out about efficiency is, yes, like it's creating, kind of circularity or like inefficiency of efficiency, but it also has consequences for workers in the sense that it kind of distorts, the professional values and workplace professional norms. Like, what does it mean to be a good nurse if the only metric you have is efficiency in your workplace? So I think that's really important. The second theme that we talked about is institutional capture, is just the fact that we're living in a time of just massive disinvestment in workers and in our institutions. So we've had, sweeping cuts to Medicaid. There's hundreds of hospitals at risk of closures. We've had defunding of libraries, universities, childcare centers. There was a national survey from the Urban Institute that found that 1 in 3 nonprofit organizations that provide community service, like food pantries or job placement services, lost funding, or they ended programs or laid off staff. So there's this kind of like void that now there's this push to kind of fill with automation. And often these like so-called staffing solutions often are just sort of either increasingly gigified labor, or it's, bringing in new forms of automation. So like there's a great report called, I forget what it's called, from Katie Wells and Funda Ostek-Spilda, on Uber for nurses, which is basically just the ways that hospitals now are increasingly relying on gig platforms to fill in staffing shortages for nurses, but it's also eroding the profession as a result.
Sure.
So the question around institutional capture is like, what are the consequences when tech companies are basically intermediating, literally everything and essentially capturing our institutions, which also brings them increasing power. It's not just about infrastructure, it's about decision-making power that they have. Like if a university is, having huge partnerships with OpenAI or other companies, like, and then they end up getting to dictate which departments get to stay at universities, then that's not just providing infrastructure.
Right.
And then the third category is sort of thinking about occupational erosion. So like a lot of the emergent struggles around automation aren't just about, preventing jobs from, disappearing, as Aiha mentioned, but also protecting occupations from just being like completely hollowed out and reshaped in the image of prevailing tech business models. And the fact that now with like large language models, one of the biggest things that's sort of unique about them is the fact that they aim to kind of replicate deep expertise of workers by, amassing all of this training data and then kind of like speaking in the language of those professions. And then the last category kind of, cuts across all of them, which is that like, how is this, exacerbating massive racial and structural inequalities that have long been embedded in our labor markets, especially because of the fact that a lot of the most vaunted applications of AI are specifically targeting, occupations that often have been racially stratified, societally devalued. So I think that those are sort of the 4 arching themes that we kind of tried to surface from all of these conversations, and that we hope can kind of be a kind of guiding framework of questions that can be asked of what does it mean when AI is brought into a particular workplace or a particular community or in that way.
Amazing. I mean, Aiha, do you have something else you want to add here?
I think the only thing I would add is these 4 dynamics interrelate with one another and interact with one another, right? The institutional capture, which has a long history dating back to neoliberal policies of, rooting out fraud, waste, and abuse in government, is tied to these questions of efficiency. And in that process, at this moment in time, we have a growing fascist leadership at the federal level, which is taking really concerted efforts to push back on DEI. So efforts to kind of address inequality, whether that's in the services provided or even definitions of what is considered valuable work, are being intensified. And so this sort of cannot be sort of taken. I think people would like many on the left to think of AI and the issues of AI and labor as separate from any of the other issues around democracy and the issues that we're fighting for right now. But that isn't possible because there's inextricably linked.
Yeah. I mean, this is great. This is like the perfect segue, because that is exactly what I was going to ask you guys about next, is like, I think that one of the things that the report does an incredible job of is linking the sort of like deployment of AI to like a long train of policy choices that really starts like in the late 70s, right? That like this is the sort of the next chapter in a longer story about the sort of like deregulation of things, the sort of privatization of public services and public goods. And I think that, I had the thing that you just said about how that is directly related to the intensification of authoritarianism in this country is something that feels very clear to me. And so I was really excited to see you all lay that out in such an explicit way. What are the things that you think workers and like everyday people should understand about the way that these decisions are being made and how they're kind of being pushed on us, and how the ideology behind them are sort of like being put behind a curtain a little bit so that we can't look at them as clearly?
Yeah, I mean, I think together with the strand of politics that you just mentioned, I think there's also, then as Aiha mentioned, is that there's also this rising techno-authoritarian project that is happening. And there's this great piece in Tech Policy Press recently by Natalie Marichal called Tech Policies on the Front Line of Fascism versus Democracy. And she made this really great point that like many in the tech policy world are still behaving as if we're living in a different time and not the time of, a huge build out of this project, that like the Sam Altmans, the Jeff Bezoses, the Elon Musk, the Peter Thiels, Alex Karp, and so on. Like they're not only bending the knee to the Trump administration, but they're also guided by a set of often incoherent ideologies, but that are intensely anti-democratic. They're often outright eugenicists. And they're certainly not, on the side of workers. So like, I don't think it's even possible to think about tech as just this, neutral thing in the first place. And then the second thing that kind of relates to this anti-democratic element is the fact that like, tech is impacting the ways that like workplaces are sites of democratic participation. So like if you're not secure in your employment, you're not secure in your ability to speak up if your employer is doing something unethical or dangerous. We saw this with like tech worker organizing, whether it was about like ICE contracts or Gaza or consumer privacy or things like that. Like it's no coincidence that companies like Meta were laying off workers who are supposed to think about things like ethics. And then Meta is then building, chatbots that are sexually soliciting minors. So like all of that is kind of tied. And I think it kind of is embodied in the ways that like often efforts to fight back against AI are often about specifically like ability for workers to have a voice in their workplace. So like one example that comes to mind is the realm of journalism. So like AI is increasingly impacting journalists in a variety of ways, as well as just, the general media ecosystem, the way the internet and the attention economy is happening and all of that. But also now increasingly newsrooms are having AI pushed on them to either have journalists like use AI to like write or like create all of these like products of like summarizing, a lot of like kind of slop dimensions. There have been like instances where like fights over AI were about fights over professional expertise. Like there was the case where the legal news service Law 360 instituted this policy requiring that every story had to pass through this AI-powered bias detection tool before publication. And the union representing the editorial staff and writers objected to this, saying that the tool impinges on journalists' discretion and expertise to choose their own tools of the trade. And something similar happened in Politico, where there was an arbitration ruling determining that the newsroom's management had violated the key like AI terms in the union contract because the AI-powered like editorial tools that they were trying to like push on them didn't meet journalistic standards of quality. So I think there's a lot of ways that like being able to have a voice in using AI impacts like how the work is done, but also how it impacts like wider communities because of the fact that like there's multiple people at the side of the equation. So like if you implement AI in schools, it not only affects teachers, it affects students. If you implement it in hospitals, it doesn't just affect, medical workers, it affects patients. So it's something that everybody has a stake in. And so everybody should have a stake in decisions of how AI is being implemented, or even possibilities of refusal because of that. It's not just about like, oh, I don't like the technology, or it makes my job harder.
I mean, it's also interesting to me, the thing that you're describing feels also related. Like, it's like I'm trying to close this loop around authoritarianism too, because it feels like there's a piece of what is happening at the sort of like policy level in our country right now that is sort of like a bunch of decisions are being made about, like, I mean, take the war in Iran as an example. Is it like incredibly unpopular like decision? It doesn't seem like anything that we do or say right now is impacting the administration's choice to continue to wage war in the Middle East. And it's like there's a kind of impunity that it's like is being replicated in all these like small ways using the rollout of this technology, right? That like it creates cover for management in some ways to be like, yeah, it's not up to us. Like, we're using this set of tools. We've decided that we're going to do this under the auspices of efficiency or whatever it might be, that then like enclose the space where workers, and then also, as you rightly say, like customers, patients, clients may have some stake in the issue, and then it's like suddenly we find ourselves like in the sort of like fenced in approved protest zone as opposed to like being able to actually grapple with power in a meaningful way. Yeah, do you have a thought about that?
I think I have a thought about that. Not necessarily with Iran, but generally sort of this conversation around what is the purpose of AI and who is actually wielding it.
Yeah.
Wielding it as a tool, right? So there's these promises that AI will make our work more efficient. It'll lead to scientific discoveries that will cure all sorts of diseases. It'll speed us to cleaner energy sources. But in the immediate moment right now, what it's primarily being used for is warfare, to spy on and scapegoat and terrorize immigrants. And they're tools of a government that actually wants to limit the regulations of the use of the tool. So they're really good questions about what is the purpose of this technology, and is it a tool for is it really a tool for work, and in what ways, and how are workers affected by that? I think, I before coming to Data and Society, worked in Los Angeles, and there you really can't separate labor from immigration. The two are so tied,
Absolutely.
right? And so the conversation around, the use of surveillance to target immigrants is a very deep labor issue. And so I think, like, to your earlier question of what do workers need to understand, is that these tools are maybe being presented as a work tool, but they affect so many other parts of society and the ways that workers are able to actually live beyond whether they do or don't do their work with the tool as well.
Well, and it also raises the question for me, you bring this up a little bit in the report as well, is like, how should we be approaching all of this like AI for social good stuff that we see being pushed on us, being like AI can be used for all of these like amazing things that help society, and that we're going to give it to organizations or government to use to do all these good things. How should we approach that? How should we be thinking about those kinds of like potential Trojan horses, I feel like, of like, here's a gift with something dangerous inside. And like, what is also the kind of the role that these AI for social good initiatives play in whitewashing some of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like Aiha mentioned, with, a lot of these promises of, AI will, cure cancer, things like that. I think that obviously, like, first of all, like, this kind of ties back to this idea of lumping AI into all one category, because we're lumping like things like machine learning with facial recognition, with large language models, with like basic automated decision making all together into one thing. But like, often, like, a lot of the more beneficial uses of AI, say like, reading MRI, scans or things like that are being used in paper over more insidious applications. I think it kind of get the sort of question of like AI for social good type things. I think it's a very tricky thing because I do think a lot of institutions are adopting AI in the absence of resources and often in an actually like well-meaning desire to be able to actually provide that. Like I was thinking of like reproductive health organizations that are like severely understaffed and under attack that are like, well, can we use this AI tool to like automate aspects of our work so we can provide more services? So like I think it's kind of, there's a lot of ways that like individual actors are kind of caught between a rock and a hard place and like wanting to be able to actually like do this. Like even in like the legal realm, there's talk of like using AI for like legal aid and services. And basically it's an argument of like, can we increase access? Often it's specifically about access, and can we bring that? But that's always been a debate that's been within technology of like, can technology be able to be used to like increase access? And I think it's pretty complicated, and it kind of gets at the question that I mentioned earlier of like how much power are we giving to like large tech actors? And I think maybe some of the solution is like, why is it that only these big actors like Anthropic are being able to like enter into this space? Like, are there ways that like technologies can be produced in a more like local, more like actually like like purpose with the communities that are actually involved in mind, rather than or actually like code? Like there's a long conversation about things like co-design and things like that, but I think I think it's often very complicated.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that just by saying, two things. One, I think the assumption to address some of these shortfalls that service providers or the nonprofit world are facing is often these days very automatically we must turn to AI. It isn't, and AI is not cheap. I think people are starting to really see that now. It was presented to us as this free or very low cost tool that anybody can use as a consumer in order to help you plan your meals or your schedule or whatever. But to actually use it in a workplace, it is going to be more expensive. And so organizations are acquiring these tools without actually having that analysis of this. Is it really going to be cheaper? Is it really going to accomplish what we want versus actually spending that money to hire more people? I can imagine in this sort of the legal defense space to address the quote justice gap. I'm sorry. I do not want an AI addressing the justice gap. But what does that mean? Does that mean a public defender, instead of spending an hour with their client, now spends only 15 minutes? Is that actually better service because an AI is able to do what? Summarize conversations, not, so there are real questions about sort of why do we default to AI as the solution for this to begin with? Because it's readily available doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to accomplish the goals. And I think that may be part of the problem is it's being presented as such a general use technology. People aren't really or not thinking critically enough about what is the pain point that's supposed to be addressed.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Go ahead, Alexandra.
I was just going to add, I think that kind of recalls the sort of Uber playbook of, flooding the market, killing other, taxi competition. And then once you've dominated the market, then you can jack up the prices. And I think that's, as Aiha, you were getting at, that like that could very well be the way that a lot of these AI tools are going, where they start out as being this like readily accessible consumer tool that, you can use to ask to, help, organize your schedule. And then, a couple years down the line, like we don't know what, 5-10 years down the line, what these tech companies are going to evolve into. And I think that needs to be kept in mind.
I think there's also an equity issue here, right? Who is being offered an automated system versus who is going to have personalized attention and access? And where does that lead us down the line? I don't think someone who's wealthy is going to turn to AI for medical care. They're going to get the best medical care, which is probably not an AI. It's not a language model. But everybody else who is poor, who's marginalized, who doesn't have the money is going to be offered this machine as an alternative or what they're capable of accessing.
Yeah, it's like they're like people with wealth who send their kids to private schools where they advertise that they don't use screens in the classroom, and it's like, I wonder what that's about.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah, there was actually a recent Quinnipiac poll that showed the attitudes towards AI are shaped by income. So, like, the only income bracket that had a more positive than negative view on AI were those with household incomes above 200,000. So that is kind of pretty telling. And it makes me think of sort of the contrast in how different workers are encountering AI. Like, I was really struck by that news story about Burger King that's rolling out this like AI system in like Burger King employees' headsets that like basically like listens to their conversations and tells them to say like please and thank you and spies on them as they do so. And then I just thought there was just a glaring contrast between that and this billboard I saw for Anthropic's Claude that was like this like beautiful like professional white collar worker in like a pristine office, and it just had the caption "Unlock Your Genius." So it was like being presented as this like empowering, like creative tool that allows you to like reach your fullest potential, as opposed to the Burger King worker who just has his voice whispering in their ears all day long, telling them to say please and thank you. So I think that's the sort of like divide that I think is sort of emerging in how different workers are encountering AI too.
Okay, just really quickly with that example, I think what it brings up is something that we've seen in older forms of algorithmic management and automation, which is these tools are used to regiment how workers behave, right? Workers know how to say please and thank you, but the point is to sort of force them to behave in a particular way, which is palatable to certain people.
Yeah, I mean, and it's also been my experience as somebody who has been a barista, been a bartender, that like I'm nicer to my customers when I'm being paid fairly. Also, it's like when I can take like and being compensated for my labor in ways that I feel like are correct. Like it's just like I remember that experience and being like working places where I'm like, why am I making minimum wage? Why should I be nice to this person when like they're being a jerk to me and I'm making $7 an hour? Like,
you don't need a bot name like Cappuccino Bot 9000.
Exactly. I mean, there's just like so much in this that the AI billboards thing is just like, it's incredible. Like how, like there's such a rich text. I live in the Bay Area. Whenever I drive to San Francisco, all I see is like the one that's like stop hiring humans. And then it's like this sort of like, almost like, I forget what company this was even for, but like the person, the like figure in the billboard is this woman who has such severe features, she almost looks a little alien. And like it's supposed to be selling me what, I'm not sure, but like the idea that I should stop hiring humans and start hiring whoever this is, this like AI agent or whatever, is just like,
could be Ozempic, it could be AI,
right.
It could be combination Ozempic AI.
Yeah, it's like there's such rich text this way, right? That's like there's a lot to be gleaned from like what their assumptions are, and like the experience of driving through San Francisco and then also down onto the peninsula is interesting because it's like these billboards are for people who are working in Silicon Valley, who are like working on startups, and I just feel like it's so different, I think, than anything. Like when I travel to other cities, you don't see this. Like it's very strange.
I think I see a very different experience in New York, some ways, which also have tons of these similar billboards about how you can essentially become your own boss and you can create 5 AI agent workers or employees for you, because I think there's a very large population in New York which also interacts with AI as well. But there's also, you're saying replace a worker, don't hire workers, but there's also tools to be your friend, replace your therapist, replace your teacher, So I think it is employment, but it's also this effort to normalize interacting with AI on a regular basis. So it becomes not inevitable, but inescapable.
Yeah, and it feels like the making that inescapable for like everyday people is about sort of entrenching this hierarchy that we were just talking about like rich people who can afford to hire actual humans to do work for them. They don't have to worry about it. But for the rest of us, it's like, well, it's fine. Everybody's doing it, which is, historically the worst argument for doing something. I'm also the fourth section that is about sort of like the ways in which AI is being used to sort of like maintain and in some ways retrench like social hierarchies, I think is also really interesting because it does cut across all of the other things, right? That like one of the things about these hierarchies is like they predate the technology, obviously, and I feel like this is such a good sort of case in point about the way in which technology can then be either used to address inequality or it can be used uncritically to sort of retrench existing inequality. Could you talk a little bit about what that reinforcement of hierarchies like looks like in practice right now with AI adoption?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of different ways. One other report that I would highly recommend is a research by our colleague Nuliak and Nebu. She wrote this really amazing report called 404 Job Not Found, What Workforce Training Can't Fix for Black Atlantans in the Age of AI. And she did this very in-depth ethnography of the workforce development, workforce training environment in landscape in Atlanta, and basically talked about the ways that like what AI literacy means, because AI literacy is not like the buzzword, like everybody has to become AI literate. Like it's never really defined. And the lack of clarity around this kind of like leads to this strategic abstraction where like government and industry actors can like push integration of AI into people's lives and like frame it as like necessary to the economy, while also just being entirely unclear as to how it can actually be harnessed to like actually benefit workers. And that this often falls along race and class lines because of the fact that like who actually has access to like these workforce training tools or can actually like empower themselves through that way versus those who often have to like take time out of their jobs to be able to like actually attend these and find childcare and all of that stuff is sort of like fallen by the wayside. And then that kind of filters out into just the decisions as to where, AI technologies are being implemented. In some industries, there's been evidence that AI is being used to eliminate jobs that have been like historically pathways for marginalized people who often have had a harder time breaking into specific industries from being able to like actually like advance and move on up within that. And I think there's this sort of like pro AI rhetoric that like AI is like this democratizing tool that it kind of enables everyone to like level up in that way. But like also if it just like creates this like situation where you're just all running as fast as you can to stay in the same place, and that actually isn't leading to greater equity. And then I think like a lot of professions that are incredibly valuable but are just not societally valued, such as care work, have been like massively attacked, massively defunded, and often they're kind of like put into this weird like box or afterthought. Like there was the recent like policy roadmap that was put out by OpenAI, where like the only mention of care work that was brought up was them saying that like, oh well, if AI is going to automate away a bunch of jobs, we can figure out a way to like retrain all of those out of work workers into like care jobs and teaching jobs and like things like that, like as if like all these workers are fungible and you can just like move them around. And the fact that like a lot of these industries have been built on specific kinds of like exploitation, like care workers, mostly like very disproportionately women, immigrants, women of color, and often have been specifically excluded from labor protections because of the fact that there is a history within that of legacies of slavery and domestic labor and race and things like that have never really been dealt with by actually like protecting these workers who are often like distributed and have never actually been protected. So I think there's a lot of different ways to think about AI and inequality from the ways that it's creating this sort of global division of labor with, data workers in Venezuela and India and Ghana doing, data work, to be able to like train these AI systems that then are treated as being like, fully autonomous when really they aren't. And those same global divisions of labor are also being recreated domestically in the US because there's also different different kinds of data labor that workers are being, paid to do in that way as well. So I think there's a lot of different axes that we can like talk about this topic on, because there's just so much going on.
Yeah, are there things that you would also lift up from this section? Because I think I don't know, there's a lot of ways, I think, to approach these inequality questions.
I think Alexandra covered most of it. I think the only thing I would add to it is the connection between inequality and professional occupational erosion. So, the argument that labor or what labor tries to do is create pathways for people to advance within the careers, get opportunities for earning more, for additional training, for more skills development. But the more that AI systems sort of flatten and kind of mimic the expertise, it is, and to be able to accomplish sort of more entry level work, it is essentially potentially cutting off these pipelines for advancement for workers. And I think what we've seen with efforts to roll back on any diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts is that this was where marginalized communities were starting to enter into certain industries, was through these pipelines. And now these pipelines are being affected. So it brings up questions about, are we essentially breaking down opportunities to address economic inequality through the introduction of AI?
Yeah, no, this is really interesting stuff. I guess as we look towards wrapping up, I'm curious like how you hope people will be able to use some of the insights that you've put together in the report. What are the ways that you think organizers can leverage some of these insights? And maybe, the report's been out for about a month. I don't know if you've heard feedback from folks about how they have been able to use it.
I can start off and just say that I think it has been done. It's been useful for people to kind of understand and situate themselves within the larger conversation around the AI economy. It seems like it is barreling forward with very little input or efforts to explain to anyone what will happen. And so this is giving them some solid ground to sort of evaluate, okay, where are we in this situation? And then our hope is that we will actually be able to use this framework to work with organizations in civil society, in labor, in policy, in order to do deep dives to really evaluate how these four dynamics, and maybe not all of them, but we think at least some of them will affect their particular industries, to arrive at very clear strategies for addressing some of this. We have seen that for some groups, like I spoke with the European Trade Union Institute, unions are really starting to try to figure out how they address these issues. And some of them may happen in bargaining, but I think other issues are going to be much broader policy focus. For example, conversations around chatbots and mental health is gaining a lot of attraction. It's being really thought of as sort of like a child safety and mental health issue, but it is also a professional and labor issue.
Right.
And so those two things, and the same thing with education. So how can these issues really bridge across movements? And I think that is our hope and something that we want to be working on. So if anyone on your listening today is interested, please reach out to us.
Yeah, I think we kind of end off before, which is maybe a little disappointing, because I think maybe people were looking for solutions, but I think what our report kind of does is set up the fact that there isn't one single solution, because isn't one single challenge or one single terrain of battles. Even when we're just thinking about policy and regulation, at the federal level, there's absolutely no appetite to regulate AI. At the state level, the federal government is trying to preempt state legislation to regulate AI. At the level of legal battles, we're still fighting oppressive technologies that have been around for 10, 15 years. We're still fighting around the gig platform economy. We're still now ramping up battles around surveillance pricing and surveillance wages. So we're only just catching up to fighting a lot of these battles. And then there's, efforts from unions to incorporate AI issues into collective bargaining. There's efforts to create mutual aid for workers that have been laid off and displaced. Tech Workers Coalition just just launched this worker center called What We Will, where they're doing a lot of different projects to like create resources for workers that have been laid off. So like I feel like there's just, and then there's sort of the education component of the fact that like AI companies are filling this gap of like education. Like for instance, like OpenAI a while ago partnered with this other organization to launch this like AI training course for K through 12 educators. Like, why is OpenAI creating this education instead of people who are actually doing education? So like, I think there's also like strategies of like, how can workers educate each other? How can like we all be in dialogue to actually create the material rather than letting AI companies fill that gap for us? So I think like the next step is just thinking about the fact that there are just so many different things to do, whether it's, thinking about impacts of data centers on communities or specific occupations or things like that. All of these are interconnected in various ways, and we just need to think about how they're interconnected and what are the kind of entry points for being able to actually challenge oppressive dimensions of AI right now in this moment.
Amazing. Well, the report is really useful for that. And I think that like the way that you've been able to like really compress a lot of pretty like complex dynamics and show the way that they're interrelated is super useful for those of us who are trying to make sense of the whirlwind of frankly bullshit that is coming to us from these AI companies. So I really appreciate it. And thank you so much, both of you, for taking the time to talk a little bit about the report and what you hope people will get out of it.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be here.
My thanks again to Alexandra and Aiha for joining me in this conversation. We'll put a link to the report, Last Place in the AI First Economy, How the AI Industry Relies on Worker Disempowerment, in the show description. This show is published by Convergence, a magazine for radical insights. I'm Kaden Mock, and our producer is Josh Elstro. Kimmy David designed our cover art. Our summer intern is Trey Nitza. Convergence Magazine is a proud founding member of the Movement Media Alliance. If you liked what you heard, please let us know. Be sure to subscribe for more episodes, tell a friend, or rate and review the show wherever you listen. It really helps us find new audiences, and it means a lot to our team. And finally, if you'd like to support the work that we do at Convergence, bringing our movements together to strategize, struggle, and win in this crucial historical moment, you can become a member at convergencemag.com/membership. Even a few bucks a month goes a long way to making sure our independent small team can continue to build a map for our movements. I hope this helps.